The midday sun hung like a branding iron in the sky over Abilene, Kansas, searing the cracked dirt of the train station yard. The heat shimmered above the rails, and the scent of smoke, horse sweat, and sun-baked timber filled the air. People bustled along the platform. Travelers, cowhands, freightmen, each moving with a kind of anxious energy, glancing over their shoulders or scanning the horizon. The war had left its mark here. The scars didn't show on the buildings, but they clung to every face. Naya Blackbird stood apart from them all. Leaning against a worn cedar post at the far end of the platform, she wore a simple blue shawl that had once been vibrant, now faded by wind and time. Her long black hair was braided neatly down her back, tied with strips of deerskin. Her face was composed, unreadable, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched every movement on the platform with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned long ago that survival meant paying attention. The station buzzed with murmured gossip and the shriek of distant hawks, but a sudden hush rippled through the crowd as a wagon pulled into the yard. It was drawn by two sorrel mares, their hides shining with sweat, and the man holding the reins looked carved from the land itself. Bo McRae climbed down from the seat in one smooth motion. Towering and broad-shouldered, he moved like a man who didn't waste effort, just deliberate, heavy steps that made the dry earth crunch beneath his boots. His duster trailed behind him, its edges coated in dust. A revolver sat low on his hip, but it wasn't the weapon that drew stares, it was the man. He removed his hat and wiped a thick forearm across his brow. His eyes, pale as weathered bone, scanned the station until they landed on her. "Naya Blackbird?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She didn't answer right away, just watched him the way one might watch a strange animal, curious but cautious. Then she gave a short nod. He stepped closer, his boots creaking against the warped planks of the platform. "My name's Bo McRae. I reckon you don't know me, but you knew my brother." Nate. At the mention of that name, her expression tightened, though her eyes didn't change. "I knew him. He wrote me before he passed," Bo said, glancing down, then back at her. "Said he married you, said you had no people left and no land to go back to. He asked me, if anything happened, to see you taken care of." Her chin lifted slightly. "He was kind to me. That doesn't mean I belong to you." Bo nodded once, slow. "Ain't what I said, but I'm not about to leave you standing here with a bag and no name they'll call you but Savage." A few townsfolk paused nearby, pretending not to listen. She drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I can care for myself." "Not in this town, you can't," he said. "Not for long. They see you as a problem that hasn't happened yet. You know it, I know it. Why do you care?" Her voice was quiet, but sharp. He met her eyes. "Because Nate asked me to. And because I don't like the idea of you sleeping in alleys or ending up in some trader's hands." She studied him again, really looked this time. The lines around his mouth weren't cruel. His hands were scarred, but clean. There was no smile in him, but no lies either. Bo extended his hand. "You got my wagon, my land, a cabin if you want it. You stay as long as you need. Or go, once you feel like going. But until then, you're coming with me." Naya stared at the hand for a long, silent moment. Then she looked behind her, at the station, at the train that wouldn't come, at the people who looked through her like she wasn't real. Finally, her hand rose and settled into his. Her fingers were calloused and warm. Without another word, he helped her into the wagon and turned the team west. Behind them, the station slowly returned to its noise and motion. But a few watchers remained still, as if unsure what they had just seen. Something quiet and strange had passed through, and it didn't leave a trail. The wagon rolled slowly across the open prairie, its wheels carving faint tracks through the dry grass. Hours had passed since they'd left Abilene behind, the sun now slipping toward the western rim of the sky, casting everything in long, amber shadows. Dust clung to their clothes and skin, and the silence between them was deep but not heavy. It was the kind of silence that belonged to people who had both seen too much and said too little for too long. Bo held the reins loose in his hands, letting the horses pick their pace. He hadn't spoken much since they left the station, and neither had Naya. There was no need for words. Not yet. She sat beside him, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the far horizon. He glanced at her once or twice but said nothing. Whatever she was thinking, it didn't belong to him. As the land stretched wide before them, the shape of the ranch came into view. First the fence lines, miles of barbed wire nailed into cottonwood posts, then the distant movement of cattle like dark spots in the grass. A cluster of wooden buildings sat low against the landscape. A barn, a toolshed, a bunkhouse, and finally, the main house. It wasn't grand, but it was built solid. 2 stories of weathered oak, smoke curling from the chimney, shutters pulled open to catch the breeze. Bo brought the wagon to a stop near the porch. The dogs barked once, then quieted as he stepped down. He turned and reached a hand up to help her, just as he had at the station. She didn't hesitate this time. Her fingers wrapped around his and she stepped down, her feet hitting the ground with practiced balance. She stood still for a moment, taking it in. The wind stirred her shawl and carried the scent of horses and hay and something older, the raw, rooted smell of land that had been fought over for generations. Naya turned slowly, her eyes sweeping across the open plain beyond the ranch. Her people had once hunted here, before the rails came and the wire fences slashed through sacred ground. She could still feel them in the wind, in the weight of the earth beneath her boots. "This place is cursed," she said, barely above a whisper. Bo paused. He didn't dismiss her, didn't laugh. He just looked out over the same land. "Ain't heard that before," he said. She turned her gaze to him, steady and unreadable. "It don't belong to you." "Not really." He nodded slowly. Maybe not to anyone, but I put my hands into it every day, and it keeps 10 men working. It feeds them, keeps their children warm. Whatever it is, it's all we got." She watched him for a beat longer, then looked back at the house. "And me, what am I here?" Bo didn't answer right away. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair. "You're not a servant, not a guest. My brother made a place for you, even if he didn't finish the work. That makes you part of this. What that means, you get to decide. And if I decide to leave, then you leave," he said. "You're not chained to this land or to me. I brought you here so you could have a choice, not so I could keep you." They stood in the silence that followed, the wind lifting strands of her hair and carrying them past her face. He nodded toward the porch. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. Inside, the house was cooler than expected, the thick wooden walls blocking the worst of the heat. The main room was plain but well kept. A stone hearth, a worn table, shelves lined with books and tools. Everything was practical, built to last, without a trace of decoration. Bo moved to the kitchen without waiting for an answer and poured water from a crock into a tin cup. He handed it to her and she drank, eyes never leaving his. He busied himself with stoking the fire, pulling bread from a larder, cutting slices of smoked meat. She didn't offer to help, and he didn't ask. It was the first time in weeks she'd been indoors without threat, without expectation. She sat down at the table, her hands resting on her lap. He set a plate in front of her, sat across from her, and picked up his own. Neither of them spoke as they ate. The fire crackled softly, and the wind howled faintly through the chinks in the wall. Outside, the prairie shifted and rolled like the sea under the moon. At some point, he glanced up and found her looking at him, not with suspicion, but with something close to curiosity. He didn't smile, she didn't either, but something between them loosened, just slightly, like a knot beginning to uncoil. When the meal was finished, she stood. "You got a room?" she asked. He nodded and led her down a narrow hall to a door at the far end. Inside was a small room with a bed, a basin, and a window that looked west. She stepped past him and placed her bundle at the foot of the bed. He didn't follow her in. "You need anything, you ask," he said. She looked back at him once before closing the door. Bo stood in the hallway for a moment longer, staring at the wood. Then he turned and went back to the fire, alone again, for now.